message is presented by the Creation Research Centre, Australia. The speaker is Mr. John Mackay. First of all, we'll have an intelligence test. What's that? That's a house. That's right. Now I don't need to drop the level of the talk any lower. You're right there. That's a house. And I've noticed over here you build houses a little differently than we build them in Australia. It must be the gravity or something, because over here you hang the tiles off the sky. Then you suspend the walls down until they reach the ground. And just when they've reached the ground, you bring in the cement trucks and you fill in the floor with concrete. You don't? No, you don't, do you? I've noticed that. You seem to build them the same way we do, even though everything over here is upside down. You see, what you do is you bring the trucks in first and you lay down the cement and make sure the foundations are good and strong. And when the foundations are good and strong, you put the walls on it. And then you put the roof on it, and then you fill it up with often such irrelevant, trivial things, like carpets and wallpaper. They don't have anything to do with holding the house up. And yet you put them inside, don't you? And you even paint inside the washroom. I've never figured that one out. But that's what we do. And not one of those things keeps the house up. You see, when you start to see cracks appearing in the wall, it doesn't really do much good for you to put a new layer of wallpaper on, does it? And if you see cracks appearing in the wall, there's not much good just shifting the Rembrandt from the left side of the room to the right. Because if you get cracks in the wall, the problem isn't usually in the wall. That's what happens to a house when the foundations are no good. It falls down. We all know that. But we don't take too much notice of it, do we? You see, the foundation is usually the last part of the house we begin to consider where the problems might be. Because, you see, we've covered it up with those absolutely irrelevant, trivial things like carpets, and we never see it anymore. And we ignore it. But that foundation is more important than the Rembrandt, more important than the walls, more important than the carpet. If that foundation is removed, the house falls down. Actually, that reminds me of something one of the psalmists wrote back there in Israel nearly 3,000 years ago. He said, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? You know what the answer is? Nothing. Zilch. Zero. Not a thing. Not till they rebuild the foundations, that is. Now, why did I tell you that? Well, there's an interesting statement that Jesus made in Matthew chapter 19. He was asked a question by the religious leaders of the day about divorce. Oh, that sounds very up to date, doesn't it? Yes. What do you teach about the end of marriage, said the religious leaders, because you see, they like new wives every third week. And they would often get rid of one wife very simply just by writing out on a bit of paper, you burnt the chicken for dinner. Out! That's enough. What do you teach about divorce, they said to Jesus, and in Matthew 19 you can read Jesus' answer. He said, oh, you great Twix. Haven't you read? Back in the beginning, God made them male and female, and that's the reason a man will take a wife. That's a rather simple argument, isn't it? Because it was in the past, therefore it is now. It was this way in the beginning, that explains how it works. Here are the rules based on history. If you want to know why the pastor says, I now pronounce you man and wife, one flesh, what God has joined together, etc., etc., you know the answer isn't in any of the words he uses. Why does he say those funny things? And Jesus said, if you want to understand how valuable marriage is, if you want to understand how precious it is, if you want to know whether it's worth so little you can just write out, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you 3 times on a bit of paper and get rid of your wife, if it's that precious, perhaps you better keep it. But how will you decide? How will you decide? Here's the answer, said Jesus. Let's go back and see its origin. Because the foundations or the origin of it gives it its meaning. And its meaning gives it its value. And its value tells you whether it's worth so much you've got to do everything you can to keep it, or whether it's worth so little you can just throw it out. That's how you decide, said Jesus. Haven't you read, you great Twix? Back in the beginning, God made them male and female. And that's the reason a man will take a wife. Now, I know something about many of you Christian folk. You don't believe that at all. You think the reason a man takes a wife is because he falls in love with a girl. I'm sorry. That's not the right foundation to build a marriage on. You don't believe me? Just talk to some of the people who've been married here for 20 years and see what happened to their last 20 years. You see, your dad fell in love with a gorgeous blue-eyed blonde 20 years ago. And now 14 children later, she's not so gorgeous and she's not so blue-eyed and she's not so blonde. In fact, she just looks like his mother-in-law. And he looks like her father-in-law. He's as bald as a tack and fat as a pig. And if the foundation for their marriage was the fact that they each fell in love with what they thought the other was, their house fell down. Their house fell down. You know, you can read all the way through the Bible and you find that love is never given as a reason for being married. It's a good reason for staying married, but it's not the reason to get married. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Haven't you read, said Jesus, back in the beginning God made them male and female, and that's the reason. Well, you better do some rethinking if you're holding your girlfriend's hand tonight, are you? You should be listening to the sermon. Now, you think about that. It's a very profound and simple statement. It's the same argument that Mum uses on little Johnny. You eat cookies 5 minutes before supper and I'll beat your hide off. It's easy to follow. You do A, B follows. As it was in the beginning, so it is now, said Jesus. Here's the origin. That gives the meaning. You want to know all about divorce, the end of marriage? The easy way to find out, said Jesus, is go back to the beginning. And the beginning is in Genesis. And do you know what happens if you get rid of Genesis? All of a sudden you can't make sense of marriage. Marriage isn't something we invented. Well, most people today think it is. And do you know what happens the minute you begin to think that? You make up the rules to please yourself. And you end up pleasing nobody, including yourself. You see, if you believe that life evolved by chance, if you believe that we invented marriage as a social institution, because you see the men kept getting killed off and that left a lot of spare women, so you had to have heaps of wives. And then we sort of evolved a little further and we voted socialist governments in, so it got too expensive to have more than one wife. And now it seems with daycare centres and all of that, you don't even need any legal marriage at all. So why have it? If you believe that that's where marriage came from, in the end you won't have any rules left about marriage because you made them all up. They're yours to make and yours to break. But you know what Jesus said? Man didn't invent marriage. Marriage was created. And in the beginning God made them male and female, and that's the reason. You get rid of Genesis and you can't make sense of marriage. You put evolution in the place of creation and all of a sudden marriage as an institution will end up going out the door. You can't make any sense of it. It doesn't have any rules left. You see, there's an interesting principle in Scripture. Every biblical doctrine has its foundation back there in Genesis. And every biblical doctrine is a house. And if you remove that foundation, here's what happens to your house. It falls down. And in any society which accepts evolution, you have a society which rejects marriage. The two are not mutually compatible. You see, the only reason marriage makes sense is because of Genesis. Get rid of Genesis, get rid of a creator, and all of a sudden the rules about marriage sort of begin to disappear. Haven't you noticed that not even the Christians today are able to keep their marriages together? I'm going to preach a lot more about this on Sunday night, on creation and marriage. But you see, once you've got rid of the foundations, your doctrine, what have you got left? You know, there's an interesting verse in Luke chapter 16. It says this: if you don't believe what Moses wrote, you won't be convinced, even if somebody rose from the dead. Have you been to a good resurrection lately? They're rather impressive, I believe. But not too common. Not too common. Can you imagine going into a morgue and there's all the bodies, serene, calm, stiff and cold, and all covered up with white calico. And as you're walking down the aisle, very respectful, one of them sits up and says, "G'day." Now we'd have to take you and lay you out and cover you up with a nice white calico sheet. Resurrections are rather impressive. And if you don't want to believe what Moses wrote, said Jesus in Luke 16, you won't be convinced, even if somebody rose from the dead. Now what did Moses write about? In 6 days God created, yes, Noah's flood, the Tower of Babel. And if you live in a society which rejects what Moses wrote, you'll live in a society which will not be impressed by the fact that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, regardless of how impressive that is. And you live in a society which begins to rebuild itself because it's got a new foundations. After all, if there is no God who put law and order and design into the universe, then there are no laws. And if there are no laws, we make our own rules. And if there are no rules except the ones we make, then you can't tell me, you Christians, I can't marry someone of the same sex. Don't you dare discriminate against me, or I'll put you in jail and discriminate against you. Hang on. Yes. You see, you don't want to be taken in by any of the politicians' arguments that you can't discriminate. Because the minute you get told you can't discriminate, you've just been discriminated against. Wake up to yourselves. You've only got one choice in this life, what you'll discriminate against. Either you'll discriminate against evil and for good, or you'll discriminate against good and for evil. You will always discriminate. If there are no rules about sex, then there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. And if there's no rules about sex, then you can't tell me to keep my clothes on, and you can't stop Hugh Hefner selling Playboy magazine. Because there are no rules about clothing. And if there's no rules about sex and clothing and marriage, then what are babies worth? Well, after all, man evolved by chance. Man is just an animal. We've killed spare cats for a long time. So why not kill spare kids? And that's how the young girls approach the question. Babies aren't worth much anymore. You know, in Australia, there's a law which says you'll be fined $5,000 for killing an unborn baby parrot. You know what they do with unborn baby parrots, don't you? They steal the eggs and they hatch them out and sell them to innocent, gullible Canadians. They do. And lots of people make lots of money in Australia that way. But the government's cracking down on that, and you're not even allowed to steal the eggs anymore. And if you do and you kill the baby, you'll get fined $5,000. And yet abortions don't even cost $200. Do you get the point? The baby isn't worth $200, an unborn parrot's worth at least $5,000. When you live in a society who believes that evolution is the history of man, then the origin of it gives it its meaning. And its meaning gives it its value. And its value tells you whether it's worth so much you've got to fight to keep it, or whether it's worth so little, like babies, you can cut them up and throw them away. If you want to fight against abortion, if you want to fight against pornography, if you want to fight against homosexuality, then come back to this. What's the foundation of all those problems? If they don't believe what Moses wrote, said Jesus in John chapter 5, verse 46 and 47, they won't believe my words either. Now, you're at university. You're struggling with creation evolution. I know what it's like. That's what I was doing. It wasn't easy. I hoped that in the end I could put both of them together. And I could sit in the middle of the road and wave to everybody. Did you know what happens when you try and sit in the middle of the road? They run you down from both directions. And in the end they throw stones from both sides of the road. And in the end you can't do it. If you don't believe what Moses wrote, said Jesus, you don't believe me. Despite the fact that you would protest to the nth degree that you're a Christian. You see, that's the argument I tried and it didn't work. I've lost heaps of arguments with God. Every time He wins, I should give it up. You don't believe what Moses wrote. You don't believe in creation. You don't believe in Noah's flood. You don't believe in the Tower of Babel. Then come to grips with one thing if you're a university student. You're calling Christ a liar. That's not very polite, is it? No, it's not. You see, when you have a look at all of those issues, you come to grips with one other thing as well. The gospel has its foundation back there in Genesis. And if you don't believe what Moses wrote, you will not be persuaded, even if somebody rose from the dead. If you live in a society which gets rid of Genesis, if you live in a society which embraces evolution, homosexuality will increase. Marriage breakdown will increase. Public nudity will increase. Abortion will increase. You see, if you live in a society which rejects Genesis, it will reject all the things that have their origin in Genesis. Do you know what you read about the origin of in Genesis? The origin of man, the origin of marriage, the origin of races, the origin of sex, the origin of nations, the origin of languages, the origin of the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the origin of the universe, the origin of the solar system. And away you go. The whole bang lot's in there. The origin of everything, which gives it its meaning. And do you want to know why abortion is murder? The answer's ever so simple. In the beginning, God made man in His image. And He's not like the animals. You're of more value than any animal, than any sparrow, said Jesus to Peter. Why? Because they're not made in the image of God. Therefore, the baby has got a value. And it's a higher value than a cat. And it's a higher value than a sparrow. Because the baby, unlike the cat or the sparrow, has a heritage in the image of God. And if you choose to dispose of that baby, then you've disposed of something which is very precious. And it's called murder. That's what it's called. And if you want to know what's wrong with homosexuality and why Paul wrote in Romans that when men leave God out of their knowledge, God turns them over to foolishness, men with men, women with women, reaping the reward in their own flesh they justly deserve. It's called AIDS. Yes. That's terribly discriminating, isn't it? It could get me into trouble, but you see, it got Jerry Falwell into trouble too, didn't it? Yes, it did. And I'm with him. I'm on his side. You see, when you have a look at what Paul was arguing about, where did he get all that basic reasoning? Well, he got it from Matthew 19, and that comes from Genesis chapter 1 to 3. You want to know what's wrong with homosexuality? Jesus said it one way in Matthew 19. Haven't you read? In the beginning, God made them male and female, and that's the reason a man will take a wife. A man won't take a husband, and a woman won't take a wife, because it wasn't made to be that way. In other words, in the beginning, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Bruce. That's it. End of the argument. When you have a look at the whole foundation of biblical Christianity, you've got to go back to that book of Genesis. Get rid of Genesis, and the rest just falls over like a pack of dominoes and doesn't make any sense. It just hasn't got any foundation left. When you have a look at the Gospel, it's a case in particular. Now, I think I've got some books over there. In fact, my Bible's over there because someone forgot to bring it early enough tonight, so excuse me for wandering over here to pick it up. When you have a look at the Gospel, you find, again, it's like a house. I get very disappointed with many Christians because, you see, they want to be New Testament Christians. And they build a house called New Testament Christianity. And it hasn't got a foundation. They want to be as enthusiastic as Paul. They want to be as enthusiastic as Peter. They want to be as successful as Luke. They want to be New Testament Christians, and they've forgotten one thing. All those New Testament Christians only had the Old Testament. Isn't that fascinating? And you know what so many Christians are doing today? They're doing something that's as silly as this. Next Christmas time, what I want you to do, and you can demonstrate this very simply, you've got a friend who's really into detective stories. They're into Agatha Christie. So what you do is you buy an Agatha Christie, see? And you rip it in half. And you gift wrap the last half. You put a nice little card with it, of course. And you give them the last half of the detective story for Christmas. And of course they're excitedly, they undo the wrapping, and they see the lovely card, and then they find half an Agatha Christie. What nut gave me this? What's the point in knowing who done it if I don't know what was done? You see, that's what happens when you try to have New Testament Christianity. When you try to give away the last half of this book to a society which doesn't know the first half, it doesn't make any sense. You see, because the good news is only good because the bad news is so bad. And the good news is in that half, and the bad news is in that half. And if you give away the good news without the bad news, quite frankly, you're irrelevant. You see, 30 years ago you could get away with it, because by and large society knew about the bad news. They had all the right jargonese in their head. They'd been to Sunday school. They even read it in the women's publications. It was even on TV in those days. Yes, and it was in the schools. But that stopped, didn't it? Because 30 years ago they brought in evolutionary textbooks. and they indoctrinated the next 3 decades of students. And now those kids don't know anything about the bad news. In fact, worse than that, they don't even believe it. They know very well that you can't believe the Bible. Why? Because they know it's in the Bible? No, they've never read it. They know that the first page is wrong, because it says, in the beginning God created, and we know that's not true. You can't believe in Adam and whatever her name is. We know that scientists have proved that ape-like creatures turn into people. We know that life evolved by random chance evolutionary processes. The scientists have told us that. The Bible's false. And if they don't believe what Moses wrote, they won't be convinced, even if somebody rose from the dead. One of the prices that Christians have paid for trying to be New Testament Christians and ignore the fact that the gospel is also built on Genesis is that they're now becoming irrelevant. Because you see, they live in a society which won't make sense of the gospel unless it has the first half. That's a very effective evangelistic technique, by the way. It's the one Paul used in Athens. He didn't begin to teach them about Jesus. He began to teach them about, I want to tell you who this God is. He is the creator of the heavens and the earth. And in 4 or 5 sentences he went from Genesis chapter 1 right through to Revelation chapter 22. And you know what it says in Acts chapter 17? And they laughed. And Paul wrote about it in the book of Corinthians. He said, the gospel to the Jews is a stumbling block, to the Greeks it's absurd foolishness. Have you ever wondered why he made those differences? Why was the gospel absurd to the Greeks, yet it was just a stumbling block to the Jews? I'll tell you. You see, the Jews already knew about this. They already expected Jesus to come. They knew that this God was the creator of the heavens and the earth, and he was going to come in this super hepped up 8-cylinder chariot, see? And he was going to sweep those Romans out, and he was going to put taxes on them, and the Jews were going to get wealthy. They knew he was coming. They were expecting him to come. And do you know how he came? No, he didn't come in a palace. He came in a filthy animal store. Have you ever heard anything as silly as that? And he rode into Jerusalem, not in a Mercedes-Benz, he was on a donkey. Yes, and they were looking for this fellow called Emmanuel. Yes. And it was all wrong. And it was too much for their pride. And they couldn't cope with it. And to the gospel, and to the Jews, the gospel was a stumbling block. Because you see, on the day of Pentecost, when Peter preached to the Jews, man, did he get at them. Did he start with Genesis and go right through to Malachi? No. Do you know what he did? He began with Joel. And he said, you did this. You crucified this Saviour. You killed this Messiah. You know all about it. Repent. And they did, thousands of them. Very easy evangelism, that. You know, when Paul went to the Greeks, he couldn't start there because that wouldn't make any sense to them. Do you know why? Unlike the Jews, they didn't have that bit. So he had to start all over again. I want to tell you who this God is. He's the Creator. You know, that's a pretty significant concept, that. It's the only one that works in a society which no longer believes what Moses wrote. It's no good starting with the last half of the story. What they need to hear first is the first half. They can't appreciate the good news that Christ came to die to forgive our sins unless they know and believe the bad news that man is a sinner. That comes from Genesis. What would you do tonight if you had just gone out today and you bought a $3,000 colour television set? You know the sort that I mean, don't you? It's one of those that changes the baby's diapers, puts the dog out, brings the cat in, sweeps the carpet. You really should have sent the money to the mission field, but we'll ignore that for the moment. And you bring it home and you put it in your lounge room and you're waiting for the latest Paul Hogan Forster's ad to come on. And nothing happens. So being cool and calm and collected and being Canadian, you kick it, don't you? You know, it never works that way. You want to get your TV set to work, do you know what you've got to do? You get the little instruction book and you open it up to page 3 and it says, plug it in, you idiot. What right have they got to tell me what to do with my TV set in my lounge room? Who do they think they are? You know something? The answer's obvious to that, isn't it? They've got every right to tell you what to do with your TV set in your lounge room for one simple reason. They created the set. Doesn't matter how much you paid them for it. The Creator has rights over His creation ad infinitum, regardless of your opinion. In fact, your opinion is, quite frankly, absolutely irrelevant. You can always tell a TV repairman. And if you've got problems with your marriage, then why don't you open it up to page 3 where it says, when in doubt, follow the manufacturer's instructions. And then turn over to page 5 where it says if you don't follow the instructions from the manufacturer, then the warranty is null and void. Isn't that what it says? Of course it is. But you see, you and I live in a society which no longer believes that that's the manufacturer's handbook. And therefore, since they don't believe what Moses wrote, they are not persuaded, even though somebody rose from the dead. Regardless of how impressive that is. Regardless of how impressive that is. Can you see now why I'm so keen on getting you to get those books and put them in school libraries? Get over there to Toronto, visit Ed Fry every now and then, pick up his book on dinosaurs, put it in your church library. Make sure that the pastor's wife has got enough money to buy the pastor a copy of that. The Genesis, that was a good hint, wasn't it? Oh, that was sturdy, that one. But look, there we are. That is a fantastic commentary. Now the sad thing is I've only got one left, so if you want to get it you'll have to order it. That's easy, we'll do that for you. Why do I recommend it? Because you see that's written for lay people. And what it does is tell you everything I've told you tonight in the context of a commentary on Genesis, not for the Hebrew expert, but for the ordinary person who wants to know, how did Noah fit all them animals on the ark? How big was the flood? Who cleaned up the droppings? All those fascinating things. What about the days in Genesis? And it takes you through verse by verse. You see, that's a fantastic handbook. In fact, I regard that as the Rolls-Royce of commentaries for the layperson on Genesis. Because all those questions, you see, you're going to probably be asked one day. Do you know what the Bible tells me? That most of the young people who give up coming to church do so because Dad didn't have a reason but the hope that lay within him when his daughter asked him a question. You see, the questions that I see being asked in families, they're very pertinent, and they're all to do with creation evolution. You know, your young daughter is coming out, and she's going to the church social down the beach, you see, it's summertime. And Dad's sitting there reading the evening paper. And all of a sudden, his daughter walks past, his eyeballs pop over the top of his glasses because she's got next to nothing on. It's the latest fashion swimwear. You got that problem? Oh, yes, I can see a few guilty ones already. And Dad says, you can't go looking like that. Why not, Dad? Well, it's just not Christian. Why not, Dad? Well, it's disgusting, isn't it? But why, Dad? Well, it's horrible, isn't it? No, but it's terrible. Why, Dad? Go and talk to your mother. Do you know why Dad lost that argument? Because he didn't know the reason there are standards for clothes is the fact that when Adam brought sin into the world, God killed the animals and death came in just like God said it would. And God took their skins and made Adam and Eve coats. And we don't wear clothes because of fashion. We don't wear clothes because they're pretty. We don't even wear clothes to keep us warm. We wear clothes because there's a basic moral problem with people. It's a simple problem. It's spelt in 3 letters. It's called sin. And if you want to know what to teach your son or your daughter about clothes, then you'd better go back and find the origin, because the origin gives them their meaning, and their meaning gives them their value. You know, women are funny, aren't they? The latest fashion for women on the beach, what are they? Well, they're very inexpensive, aren't they? Because there's almost no material in them. I never figured out women. Once they used to complain they had nothing to wear, now that's all they do. Wear. And you can't figure out what to teach your daughter. By the way, Dad, that's your job. Doesn't the Bible say the father will teach the children the ways of the Lord? And you can't leave it up to Mum. And you better teach her that boys were created different too, because you see, she's a girl, she'll never figure it out. They don't. Oh, that's getting embarrassing. If you need lessons, come and see me.
That completes Side A. Please fast forward and prepare for Side B.